Parshas Vayakhel. Although the Mishkan has been described in great detail in previous Parshas, but this is the Parsha in which Moshe commands the children of Israel to begin building the Mishkan. So he gathers them all together, and then and describes the mission. And then in the second Aliyah, Sheni, which is in Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Chaf Aleph, that's 35:21. The Torah says as follows: Vayavo'u kol ish asher nisa'o libo, and every man whose heart lifted him, v'chol asher nodva rucho oso, and everyone whose spirit urged him. Heviu es trumas Hashem, they brought the donation to God, l'melachas ohel moed, to the work of the tent of meeting, ulechol avodaso ulevigdei hakodesh, to all of its work, and to the holy vestments. Now, I'd like to focus just on the first part of that verse. It says, "Vayavo kol ish asher nisa'o libo." Every man, Ibn Ezra says this applies generically, men and women, and we see later that women are included. But here, I'd like to focus not on the ish part, but on the nisa'o libo, that his heart lifted him. And then we have a chol asher nodva rucho, and everyone whose spirit urged him or pushed him. So, is there a difference, or is this just repeating the same thing in different words? So we know there's no surplusage in the Torah. The Torah doesn't have any extra words. Sometimes there's poetry or poetic description in which some of the commentaries will say kefal inyam b'milim shonos, that they repeated the theme in different words. The Malbim generally takes issue with that, and he says that everything, the nuances are and distinctions among the words are important. But in any event, here, this is not poetry. This is precision. So what's the difference between Nisa'o Libo, whose heart lifted him, and Nodva Rucho, whose spirit moved him or urged him to contribute? Well, the Ramban looks at the context, and he looks at the fact, and he looks at the people who are doing these crafts, and he observes that this is somewhat remarkable. He says, no one trained as an apprentice for craftsmanship or for fine arts in Egypt. They didn't learn the craft. They were they're workers with their hands. They did heavy work, hard work, backbreaking work. That's what the Torah tells us. They weren't craftsmen. They didn't learn craftsmanship. So he says that what we're talking about is a naturally gifted person, that's somebody who recognizes in himself. He discovers his own abilities, and then he musters up the courage to approach Moshe Rabbeinu and say, I will do everything that our master, meaning Moshe, commands. In other words, it's somebody who has a certain talent, a natural talent, not a learned talent in this case, although could have been with a learned talent, but it's somebody who has two things. Number one, he has the capability, maybe three things. He has the capability, that's number one. Number two, he recognizes that he has the capability. And number three, he's willing to put himself out there and say, I'll do the craftsmanship. Now, that's different than Nodva Rucho. Nodva Rucho is somebody who is motivated to contribute. How is he contributing? He's contributing materials. So there's all kinds of materials. There's fine metals, there's gemstones, there's woven textiles, there's skins, there's wood, there's dyed wool, there's all kinds of things that people may have had. And the Torah says that they contributed, and they contributed abundantly, to the point that there was, at some point, there was more than enough, and they said, okay, stop, that's all there is. But then somebody's got to take charge. So we know one thing. We know that Hashem is the one who designated the CEO of this project, the master craftsman. We know that from the previous Parsha of Kisisa, which in Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Beis, the Torah says, Re'eh Karasi B'Shem. See, I have called by his name, Betzalel ben Uri ben Chur Lamate Yehuda, this Betzalel, son of Uri, son of Chur, of the tribe of Yehuda, Va'amalei Oso Ruach Elohim, and I have filled him with a godly spirit. And now there's the specification, B'chochma, B'tvuna, B'das, B'chol Malacha, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and all types of crafts. Lachsho machshavos, to make designs or plans. Lasos b'kesef, b'zohav b'kesef v'anchoshes, b'charoshes oven l'malos, b'charoshes eis latzos. He can work with metals. He can work with stone. He can work with wood. Lasos b'chol malacha. He's across the board. He can do everything. And I also gave him an assistant, and ubelev kol chacham lev, and in the mind of every wise person to whom nosati chachma, I gave that wisdom. In other words, people have natural talent, and Hashem gives people this natural talent. People don't have the identical natural talents, but they have natural talents. So when a person has a natural talent, he has to recognize it, and then he has to have the courage to actually contribute, to say, I can do this. Now, sometimes a leader can be somewhat skeptical about a person's capabilities, so you test it out. But at the end of the day, there's got to be an understanding in each individual of what his capabilities are. Not everybody's capable of everything. Bezalel happened to have had God-given gifts across the board. And then there were people underneath him who did much of the work. As it says in Perek Lamed Vav, Pasuk Aleph, V'asa Bezalel v'Eliyav, and Bezalel and Eliyav, we identified them in last week's parsha. V'chol ish chacham leiv asher nosan Hashem chachmot v'no bahima. And every person who had a wise mind to do everything that Hashem said, had the understanding, la'asos es kol melechas avodas hakodesh v'chol asher tzivah Hashem, to do all of the holy work that Hashem commanded. So there were, let's call them minions. There were craftsmen, sub-trades, who performed the work under the supervision of Bezalel, but every single person there was not an apprenticed, trained craftsman. They were all people who had a natural talent, and they were willing to put themselves out there and contribute to the holy undertaking of building the Mishkan. In fact, a few verses later, the Torah says, "V'chol isha chachmas leiv yadei tavu," and every woman who had the capability, the natural skill, chachmas leiv, she spun the wool with her hands. So, and there's additional description there. And the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berliner, says in his commentary, Emek Davar, he says that this is talking about Kol Isha Sheliba Botach Sheta'aseh V'Tatzliach. Every woman who was confident that she could perform and be successful. This is, to my mind, a remarkable compilation of thoughts here, right here, when it's talking about the Mishkan. The implication is pretty clear, which is that the Almighty gives each of us certain talents. In fact, the Ramban refers to the pasuk in Yeshaya. It says, "Korei doros merosh," that Kadosh Baruch Hu reads or declares the generations from the beginning. And the Medrash in Shemos Rabbah, this is in Mem Beis, that's 42, paragraph 2, chapter 40, paragraph 2 of the Medrash Rabbah on Shemos. It says, Her'a oso sifro shel Adam Arishon, v'amar lo, kol echad hiskantiv me'oso shah. He says, he showed the book of Adam and said, every single person who will come from him, I've set him up. I've put in the ingredients. I've established him. Va'af Bezalel me'oso shah hiskanti oso, including Bezalel. It's not only Bezalel, but it's including Bezalel. In other words, that it is the Almighty who programs each and every one of us with the talents, with the skills that we have, with the potential that we have. It's up to us to recognize it and to galvanize that potential. It's up to us to understand when we have something special. In fact, the Ibn Ezra says, Asher nisa'o libo, the Ibn Ezra says that it's somebody who understands that he has something greater than his peers. Nasi, which we call a prince, a leader is somebody who is above the others. It doesn't necessarily imply better as a human being, but it does imply better in the craft. Somebody who has the capability that exceeds those of his peers, that is exceptional. One might see in this an obligation to recognize one's predilections, to recognize one's talents and abilities, and to extract them and to use them l'shem shamayim, and to use them for the sake of heaven. Because ultimately, as we've discussed in the past, every one of us is created for a purpose. God had a specific purpose in mind, as it were, for each one of us when he created us, and he gave us the capabilities, the talent, the potential to fulfill that purpose. The Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about how every individual is unique. And in fact, the first verse of Shema, V'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha You will love, and according to Chazal, it means not only love, but you will cause others to love Hashem with all of your mind, with all of your desire, and with all of your ma'od. What's ma'od? A lot. With all of your a lot. Whatever the Almighty has bestowed upon you, you got to use it. You have to use it because that is your purpose in life. And if you do, you will get a sense of satisfaction out of living that is unparalleled and unachievable any other way. I'm going out on a limb there, but I think it's true. Have a good Shabbos.